The Beatles Albums, a Musicological Study, Part 1, Please Please Me. Warning, this is not a Beatles fan channel. This is a conspiracy channel. If you think you will be triggered by this content, please stop watching now. Hello, and welcome back to my channel. Over 25 years ago, when I was still a music student, I'm now a music teacher, I did a module on popular music, which was basically a quick analysis of every Beatles song from their UK albums. This was a largely listening exercise, and I didn't have to write out every single chord or ponder on every single beat. The purpose of that study was to reflect upon how the Beatles had changed the shape and history of popular music. This will be the first video in a long series of videos in which I analyse all the Beatles songs on their UK releases. And I hope to cover them in the order that they learnt them, or at least the order that they recorded them. This video specifically will cover the songs on their first album, Please Please Me. My aim for this study is for it to be more in-depth than the one I had made as a student. Even so, these videos will only contain highlights of my findings. Otherwise, I would end up with videos that were many hours long. This video will discuss the cover songs more briefly than the original songs. First of all, we're going to look at a couple of introductory ideas, and then the rest of the video will divide into two parts. The first part will look at what the Beatles learned from the covers they made on their first album, Please Please Me. And then in the other part, we'll do an analysis of their original songs, the songs attributed to John and Paul, where we're looking for anomalies. We're looking basically at the plausibility that they had any hand in their authorship. So before we start, I'll just mention a few sources I used for my research. I consulted the work of the musicologist Alan Pollack, who was one of the first people to analyse the Beatles songs, and also the work of another musicologist called Walter Everett. I read the work of the music critic Ian MacDonald in his book Revolution in the Head, which is about the Beatles albums. But the two key books for me were All the Songs, the story behind every Beatles release, and the complete Beatles scores. I wasn't allowed to use a score when I did my first study all those years ago as a student, but I'm going to use one now. And you will see many images from that book in the second half of this video. So here we have Please Please Me from 1963, 14 tracks that were released in the UK on the 22nd of March that year. 8 of them were original songs and 6 were covers, and it had a total running time of 31 minutes and 59 seconds. Official Beatles history says that this album was recorded in one day, on the 11th of February 1963, with the idea to capture their live act on vinyl. So this album is meant to be a live-in-studio album, except the problem is that it doesn't sound live, it sounds really highly polished. Let's have a look at the burning question. Could the Beatles record the whole album in one day? A lot of people ponder over this idea. Could the Beatles, in fact, record 14 songs in one day? Well, first of all, they didn't actually have to, because 4 of them had already been recorded and released as singles and B-sides. On the 11th of February 1963, only 10 songs needed to be recorded, and those 10 songs had a total running time of 23 minutes and 14 seconds. But if you wanted to record 32 minutes of music in one day, could it be done? Well, yes, actually. It's done by classical musicians and studio session players all the time. So it is possible, and certainly 23 minutes and 14 seconds would be possible, but only really by very experienced musicians. And that's where the Beatles and their story runs into trouble, because could the Beatles, a group with no formal training and little studio experience, record 23 minutes of music in one day to a high enough standard for a commercial release? Well, probably not. And this would have only been possible if the band had rehearsed those songs to absolute perfection. And I think the playlist included songs that were not well known to the Beatles. And this is especially true if the original songs were not actually written by the band. If we factor in the polished finish of this album as well, then the story becomes even less likely. Let's have a look at the recording sessions for the Beatles on the 11th of February 1963. So we have a morning session that ran from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. in which they recorded There's a Place and I Saw Her Standing There. Then they have a break between 1 and 2:30 in the afternoon. Then the afternoon session ran from 2:30 p.m. to 6 p.m. in which they recorded A Taste of Honey, Do You Want to Know a Secret, the overdubs for A Taste of Honey, the overdubs for There's a Place, the overdubs for I Saw Her Standing There, and the song Misery. Then they have another break from 6 till 7:30 p.m. and then a final evening session of recording between 7:30 p.m. and 10:45, in which they record Hold Me Tight, which doesn't actually make it to the album, it goes into the next album, Anna, Go to Him, Boys, Chains, Baby It's You, and Twist and Shout. The total recording time, then, on this day, is 9 hours and 45 minutes, which is quite a Herculean task. And they have a total break time of 3 hours, although the story does go that they actually did a lot of rehearsing during their break time. I'd like to relay a true story of some friends of mine as a comparison. Back in the late 90s, when I was about 17, some friends of mine from school, they'd formed a band and they entered a songwriting competition. The prize was a day recording at Abbey Road, and amazingly they won. And they really did spend a whole day at Abbey Road. In fact, they actually spent 25 and a half hours straight, so they more than got their prize worth. And in that day, they recorded 3 tracks that was about 12 minutes of music. So the Beatles recorded 23 minutes of music in one day, and my friends, who had rehearsed within an inch of their lives, thinking they would never ever get the opportunity ever again, they managed 12 minutes. Now, my friend's band, they played live an awful lot. In fact, they played live at every possible opportunity. They were playing 3 songs that they had written themselves. They had rehearsed them over and over and over because they wanted to make sure they did a really good job and came away with something that they could be proud of. I can't imagine that the Beatles could have worked any harder than my friends did. And yet the Beatles record almost twice as many minutes in perhaps less than half the time. It's not a fair comparison, really, because my friends had to mix down and master their recordings all on the same day, which is not common practice, and it's not something that the Beatles had to do. But still, it's an interesting comparison that perhaps the Beatles were maybe 4 or 5 times more efficient than my friends were in the same studio. So here's the track listing for Please Please Me. I've included the running times and also the official composer. Here I have highlighted the 8 songs that were supposedly written by John and Paul. I Saw Her Standing There, Misery, Ask Me Why, Please Please Me, Love Me Do, P.S. I Love You, Do You Want to Know a Secret, and there's a place. Here in pink, I've highlighted the 10 songs that were recorded on the 11th of February 1963. Of those 10 songs, 6 are covers and 4 are originals. It's true to say that recording covers, particularly well-known covers, would have been easier for the Beatles than recording a stack of original songs, but even so, recording 10 songs in one day is still a tall order. Before we start, I want to acknowledge that my channel is not a music channel, and my audience are made up of people who may be musicians, they might be classically trained like I am, but equally they could have never picked up an instrument and know nothing whatsoever about music. So I just want to say a few things about harmony. This is not a music lesson, but I want to point out a few ideas, because if I don't, those people in the audience that know nothing about music will be absolutely left behind. So here is a major scale. I've chosen E major because it's the scale that's used the most on this album. Normally when people illustrate these sorts of things, they start with C, but actually that's of no real use to us. So here is E major. We have a note row, E, F sharp, G sharp, A, B, C sharp, D sharp, and then E again, which is the same note but up an octave. That's why it's in a bracket. And then I've numbered those, 1 through 7. 8 again is in a bracket because it's the same as 1. And then underneath you've got the Roman numerals, and these relate to the chords that we can form on top of these notes. Don't worry too much about those. I just want to point out how we form the chords. So on top of these 7 notes, I can make 7 chords. If I want to make chord 1, I start at note 1, and then I alternate the notes thereafter. So I can take E, G sharp, and B, 1, 3, and 5. That would make the first triad, the first chord, E major. And then I can move to the second note, which is F sharp, and take every other note to form a triad, F sharp, A, C sharp. That would be chord 2, notes 2, 4, and 6. Then I can move to the third note, which is G sharp, and I again alternate, so I get G sharp, B, D sharp, and that's my third triad, and so on, and I can go all the way through until I make 7 chords, 7 triads. On this screen, we can see those scale notes again, they're on the far left, the Roman numeral again, which I'll come back to in a moment, the pitches, the notes that I chose, that form my triads, that form my chords, and then the name. And what I really want you to pick up on is that in this major scale example, E major scale in this case, chord 1, chord 4, and chord 5 are all major. The others are minor, apart from 7, which is diminished. There are no augmented chords here. So 1, 4, and 5 are major. The others are minor, and 7 is diminished. Let's have a look at a minor scale example, and I've chosen F sharp minor. There aren't many sections of this album that are written in a minor, but this is one of the few. We see this on A Taste of Honey. So here we have the note row that forms F sharp minor. This is the harmonic form. F sharp, G sharp, A, B, C sharp, D, E sharp, and then F sharp again. And again, I've numbered them, and I've given the Roman numeral, and I will explain the Roman numeral in just a moment. I can derive chords exactly the same way, because I've got 7 distinct notes, and I will build my triads exactly the same way that I did in the major example. So chord 1, I start on note 1, F sharp, and then I alternate A and C sharp to build my triad. Chord 2 is G sharp, B, and D. Chord 3 is A, C sharp, and E sharp, and so on. Right, so now I have those same notes on the far left, with the Roman numeral, with the pitches that feature in those triads, those chords, and then the chord name again. Note that I have major, minor, augmented, and diminished chords. And note that chord 1 is minor, chord 4 is minor, and chord 5 is major. And chord 5 is major because we've rigged it that way. Chord 5 is always major. And that's very deliberate. Chord 5 serves a great many very important purposes in music. It's important that it's always major when we're working in these two different kinds of scale, major and harmonic minor. Okay, so the Roman numerals, firstly, they tell us the number of the chord. But secondly, we have uppercase and lowercase. The uppercase denotes a chord that is major or augmented. The lowercase denotes a chord that is minor or diminished. And I didn't have to, but I have actually added the little symbols for augmented and diminished. So the symbol for augmented is a plus sign. The symbol for diminished is a little circle. I'm not really expecting you to remember a great deal from all of that. I just want you to hang on to a couple of basic ideas. In any major or minor key, we have 7 notes on top of which we can build 7 triads, 7 chords. Okay, so we have 7 notes, we have 7 chords. Chords 1, 4, and 5 are primary harmony, and I've shown the example of E major here again, and I've shown the primary harmony chords in red. Primary harmony is like primary colours, I guess. We have 7 colours of a rainbow and we have 3 primary colours. And the primary harmony are chords that are very open sounding, they're very pleasing, they work well together, but also harmonically they serve a very important purpose. If, like in this case, I have E major, all of the notes of E major feature in those 3 chords. Between those 3 chords in red, I have E, F sharp, G sharp, A, B, C sharp, and D sharp. They're all there, all the notes of that scale. So when I make my melody, where I'm essentially just reordering those notes in order to construct a melody, I can put one of these chords with it to support the melody at that point in the music. I get a basic tune, kind of like a basic recipe. It might not be fancy, but it'll work. So the point is, I can do simple, basic harmonization of a song just using these 3 primary chords. The secondary harmony is everything else. And chord 2 and chord 6 typically are not too difficult to work in. Chord 3 and chord 7 are a bit more challenging because they are chords that sound a little bit more challenging, particularly 7. But if you have experience and a bit of knowledge, you can do it. So on top of these basic recipes, if you like, these basic ideas, I can then start to play with these chords. So first of all, I could invert them. I could change the order that they are featured in the music. I don't have to play them in what we call root position with the named note at the bottom. Then I could extend the harmony by adding notes on top of the basic triad, like a 7th or a 9th. I can then substitute notes. Usually that's done temporarily and then they're brought back to their normal running order. Or I can sharpen or flatten some of the notes to produce other kinds of chords. I can suspend chords, I can augment them where I make the gaps between the notes bigger, or I can make them diminish where I make the gaps between the notes smaller. I can then borrow chords from other keys, and that's helpful when we're moving between keys. But all of this more advanced stuff needs practice. You either need to have gone to some sort of formal training. It might be one-on-one with a teacher, or it might be music college. It might be just reading a series of really good textbooks, but there has to be some kind of instruction. because your only other alternative is to have a lot of hands-on experience where you're just experimenting. You could learn that way, but that is a long route and it takes time. And when we think about the Beatles songs, the one thing they didn't have was time, because they were pushing out songs at a tremendous rate. They had a new album out, I think, something like every 6 months. And every album has, maybe 14 or more songs. It's a lot of work if you're just stumbling around in the dark. So these are just some basic ideas to think about going forward, because I'm going to talk about harmony quite a lot when we get to the analysis of the Beatles songs. What did the Beatles learn from the songs that they covered? Since they appear to have had no formal training, the songs that the Beatles covered would have actually been essential to them. All of their learning was hands-on and done by ear. So firstly, let's look at Anna. Anna, go to him. So here we have the credit information. The official songwriter is Arthur Alexander, and officially, who knows, right? And officially the musicians were John, Paul, George and Ringo in their normal beat combo order, with the lead vocal being John's. We're told they have 3 takes on the 11th of February, 1963, in Studio 2 of Abbey Road Studios. The technical team is George Martin, Norman Smith, Richard Langham, and A.B. Lincoln. Let's look at the backstory. So Anna was supposedly one of John's favourite songs, so he suggested covering it for the album. This song was part of the Beatles' usual repertoire, so its recording in just 3 takes could make sense, especially as the recording does sound a little rushed. Whether the Beatles played it or professionals just dashed it off quickly, it's John's vocal that really pulls it together and provides the soul of the piece. This was the song that the Beatles recorded in the evening session, and they recorded it directly after Hold Me Tight, which was a recording that was meant to be an original on the first album, and they failed to finish it. So I suspect when they recorded Anna, they might not have been in the best of moods. That may account for the slightly rushed nature of this recording, which is unusual because this album is generally very polished. The main key of this song is D major. It was originally C, and then the song very briefly moves into A major. The time signature is 4/4. In fact, the time signature of every song on this album is 4/4, apart from a section of A Taste of Honey. And the form, we're going to see this quite a lot. Introduction, verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, with a complete ending. It does not fade out. It has regular phrasing. In the phrases and section lengths, we see typically 4, 8 or 12 bars or measures. It has a sum total of 6 different chords: D major, B minor, E minor, A major, G major and E major. So in the key of D major, that represents chords 1, 2, 4, 5 and 6. That's the primary harmony plus chords 2 and 6, which are the easiest to use secondary harmony chords. And when the song goes into A major, we see chords 1 and 5. So we have primary harmony, some secondary harmony, but nothing exotic. No inversions, no extensions, no exchanges, suspensions, nothing's augmented or diminished, and there's no borrowed chords. And the total range of the vocals, that's not just the lead, but also any backing vocals, is roughly 1.5 octaves. The typical rhyme scheme is A, A, B, C, D. Some general observations. Anna is an early soul ballad, which was given a slightly more rock feel by the Beatles. It has a gently swinging rhythm in the guitar parts and syncopation to the drumming. The melody is diatonic, that is, it uses notes only from the scale that was used to create it. It's given a lift in the bridge section via its key change, rising by a fifth. The Beatles' cover is more syncopated and slightly slower compared to the original. It's also missing the string section. The fade-out ending is replaced with a complete one, because of course if you're going to play something live, it needs to completely finish. You can't fade out whilst playing on stage. There's a strong emphasis on the use of chords 1 and 6 that can be seen in this song, and also other songs attributed to John and Paul as the songwriters, for example Misery, which is also on this album. I wonder if this is done to create a sense of cohesion across this album and indeed the Beatles' career. Were the Beatles, or whoever was writing on their behalf, inspired to include this idea in their own songwriting because of songs like this one? Alternatively, maybe chord 6 featured so largely in the Beatles' songs simply because it is a number favoured by the occultists. So let's look at Chains. This is a Jerry Goffin and Carole King song, supposedly. I actually doubt that as well, but never mind, that's another story. The official musicians again, we have the Fab Four. George is on lead vocals this time. Again recorded on the 11th of February 63 in 4 takes. And again we find ourselves in Studio 1 for the mixing. On the 25th of February 63, the technical team is George Martin, Norman Smith, Richard Langham and A.B. Lincoln. So a little bit about its backstory. The version of this song that was known and loved by the Beatles was by the American black female vocal group The Cookies. It was a popular tune on both sides of the Atlantic, so the Beatles decided to cover it. The lyrics are also interesting. My baby's got me locked up in chains, and they aren't the kind that you can see. And I wonder if this is a prediction of the invisible agenda yet to come. Also, while we're talking about lyrics, I'll just point out that I'm not going to discuss lyrics in this series of videos because I'm planning another series of videos where I only talk about the lyrics, both played forwards and backwards. So I'm saving talk about the lyrics for that. So the song itself was originally in D major for the Cookies version. The Beatles play it down by a third in B flat major. Again, the time signature is in 4/4. The form, introduction, verse, verse, bridge, verse, and an outro with a fade out, which is slightly unusual because they don't normally bother with those. That usually is the indicator that they had no intention of ever playing it live, or possibly that something went wrong in the recording and they just faded it out rather than fixing it. The phrase and section lengths, again, we see regular phrasing, typically 4, 8 or 12 bars in the phrases and section lengths. A total of 6 chords are used: B flat 7, E flat 9, F9, F and E flat minor. So in the key of B flat major, that represents chord 1, chord 1, 7, chord 4 with an extension of a ninth, chord 5 and chord 5 with an extension of a ninth. It also uses chord 4 borrowed from the parallel minor of E flat minor, the tonic minor. It means that chord becomes minor rather than major as it was in B flat major. So we have a combination of primary harmony but uses of extended chords and borrowed harmony from the tonic minor or parallel key. And the total vocal range of the song runs an octave and a half. The typical rhyming scheme is A, B, B. So some general observations. The Beatles version is a bit faster than the Cookies version. The basic song is unchanged, but with one noticeable difference being that the original featured a saxophone and this was substituted with a harmonica in the Beatles version. The verse of the song has 12-bar blues form. Despite this, it has a number of exotic sounding 9th and 7th chords, which enable some additional bluesy moments to take place in an otherwise diatonic song. This is the first occasion that we hear the boys sing a 3-part harmony throughout the verses of a song. Whilst we do hear moments of three-part harmony on other songs on this album, we won't hear them sing consistently in three-part harmony again until they record This Boy as the B-side to I Wanna Hold Your Hand. The fade-out ending of the original version loops into a repeat of the words Chains of Love. The Beatles version is more playful with the tonality of its ending. It stretches out the last repetition of the same words over two versions of that same chord. First we hear chord 4 in its major form in the key of B flat major, which is E flat major, and then it switches to E flat minor as it fades out. Boys. The official songwriters are Luther Dixon and Wes Farrell. Again, we have the Fab Four as the official musicians, with Ringo on lead vocals. And we are told that this was recorded in one take on the 11th of February 63, with them mixed down in Studio 1 on the 25th of February 63. The technical team is George Martin, Norman Smith, Richard Langham and A.B. Lincoln. The backstory. Again, this song was a favourite of the band, but this time by another American girl group called the Shirelles. It became Ringo's signature tune. He'd played it with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and Pete Best had played it whilst he was with the Beatles, so it made sense to continue to play it regularly with the Beatles when Ringo joined the band. In the Shirelles version, the song is performed in the key of G major. The Beatles, again, bring it down into the lower key of E major. We're still in 4/4. The form is intro, verse, verse, bridge, verse as a guitar solo, verse, bridge, and outro with a fade out, which is interesting, again, because they played this a lot live. So when they played it live, they had to have had an ending. I suspect the ending had errors and they just faded it out rather than fixing it because it saved time. Again, we have regular phrasing, typically 4 or 12 bars or measures in the phrases or section lengths. We have just 3 chords in this song, B7, A7 and E7, which in the key of E major corresponds to chord 1, 7, 4, 7 and 5, 7. So we only have primary harmony, but all of those chords are extended. And in fact, we can make a direct comparison to I Saw Her Standing There later on, because it uses exactly the same chord choices. And again, we have a vocal range of an octave and a half, and the typical rhyme scheme of A-A-B. Some general observations. Again, the key has been shifted down in the Beatles version from G major to E major, and the piano and saxophone parts of the Shirelles version have been omitted in the Beatles rendition. The Beatles bring the backing vocals right in from the beginning and sing far more spiritedly than the Shirelles do. Their performance is rather more cool and laid back. The Shirelles layer on more vocals as the song develops, rather than throwing them all on at once as the Beatles do. This song uses a 12-bar blues form and exploits a fairly old trick of modifying the backbeat and arrangement for the bridge section in order to disguise the fact that the chords are unchanged from the verse. The Beatles clearly love playing the song, and it sounds far more raucous than many of the other songs on this album, with wild, joyful screams coming from the band throughout, and especially from Paul. We hear Ringo telling George to take it away, George, for his guitar solo. Now, whether they were genuine or whether they were asked to do that, I can't say, but it does sound sort of authentic. I'm extremely conflicted with the covers on this album, and with this one especially. Are the covers performed by session players with the Beatles' vocals sung on top, or were they fully played by the Beatles? It's true that they played these songs live very frequently, especially this one, Boys. Therefore, they should have been able to record them for the album. But did they really record this song in just one take? Or is that really just a reference to Ringo's singing, his signature tune? a song that theoretically he should have known very well. This song sets a trend for Ringo. He gets relegated to either singing covers, often country songs, or novelty songs on the Beatles' albums from this point forward. Baby It's You. Official songwriters Mac David, Barney Williams, and Burt Bacharach. And in addition to the Fab Four, the official musicians are listed, with George Martin on the Celesta, John providing the lead vocal. The main track is recorded on the 11th of February 63, and the Celesta playing by George Martin is performed on the 20th of February 63. We're told this song is recorded in 3 takes, with the mixdown again on the 25th of February 63. The technical team is George Martin, Norman Smith, Stuart Eltham, Richard Langham, A.B. Lincoln, and for the first time, Geoff Emerick. If you've read Geoff Emerick's book, Here, There and Everywhere, My Life Recording the Music of the Beatles, you'll know that he gives nothing away about what was actually recorded in this recording session and the few that follow. He only gives his impression of what the Beatles were like as people. So he was definitely a company man to the bitter end. The backstory. Again, this is another song originally performed by the Shirelles, of which John was a big fan. Other than that, there seems to be no particular reason for its presence on the album. The Shirelles version was originally performed in B-flat major, and once again, the Beatles lower the key down into G major. The time signature is 4/4. The form is intro, verse, bridge, verse, bridge, verse as a Celesta solo, bridge, and outro with a fade out. I can't help but feel it's really odd that so many of the covers have fade out endings when the Beatles will have played these live on stage with a very complete and definite ending. I'm aware that there was a trend in recording at the time to have fade outs, but if you've already learnt an ending, why have a fade out? The phrase or section lengths are mostly regular, but there is some irregular phrasing. There is, for example, a 6-bar or measure intro. Most of the other phrases are either 8 or 12 bars or measures. There's a sum total of 5 different chords: G major, E minor, C major, A minor, and D major. These chords represent chord 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6. So there's primary harmony, some secondary harmony, but no inversions, extensions, exchanges, augmented chords, diminished chords, suspended chords, or borrowed chords. Once again, the vocal range is an octave and a half. The rhyme scheme is AABB. Some general observations. The original version includes an organ, and the Beatles instead include the Celesta, courtesy of George Martin. A piano overdub was also recorded by him on the 20th of February, but discarded in the final mix. George Martin's overdubbed parts very neatly link the final sections of the song together, more so than in the original version. George Martin's work here gives the impression of an instrumental break, but really it's just the first half of the verse played instrumentally, followed by the vocal in the second half. There's heavy use again of chord 1 to 6 in the chord progressions. In fact, the verse begins with chord 6 rather than chord 1. This adds to the myth of the idea of the Lennon-McCartney songwriting trait. The song modulates into the relative minor of E minor for the bridge. The song's final phrase is extended to an uneven length on the fade-out by John's improvised vocal. This song was second from last in the recording playlist from the 11th of February 63. It could be said that the Beatles sound a little tired here. Again, the Shirelles perform this in a higher key of B-flat, with their vocals more breathy and soulful, but John's performance is more intense. When he pleads, "Don't leave me all alone," we really believe he meant those words. A Taste of Honey. official songwriters Bobby Scott and Rick Marlowe. Again, we have the Fab Four as the official musicians, with Paul on lead vocals. We're told this was recorded in 7 takes on the 11th of February 1963, with the mix down on the 25th of February. The technical team is George Martin, Norman Smith, Richard Langham and A.B. Lincoln. The backstory. The Beatles knew the Lenny Welch version of this song. It was a sticky, sweet love ballad that John disliked. In fact, he renamed it A Waste of Money to wind up Paul. But Paul was very fond of it. Its inclusion on the album was as its moment of sophistication, intending to attract a wider, more mature audience and not just teenage girls. And I hate to admit it, but as a teenage girl, I did not like this song. As a 44-year-old woman, I can appreciate it, so maybe they were onto something. I also wonder if there might be some other hidden agenda, because the title is also shared with a play or film that was released in 1961. The film, A Taste of Honey, based on the play written by Sheena Delaney, was based in Salford, and generally in the Manchester area. And it contained a story of social unrest. We have a 17-year-old girl who gets pregnant out of wedlock. We have homosexuality, drug taking, alcoholism. And we have to wonder, was that meant to be a warning of things to come? Because it sounds an awful lot like the social change that we have all bore witness to, and which the controllers intended. So A Taste of Honey is performed mostly in the key of F sharp minor. We'll get to that in a moment. The verses are in 3/4 waltz time, and the bridge is in 4/4. The form is intro, verse, bridge, outro, with a complete ending. It does not fade out. It has mostly regular phrasing, but some irregular phrasing. We see 10-bar phrases in this song, as well as 8 or 16 bars or measures. It has a sum total of 7 chords: F sharp minor, A major, E major, B major, F sharp minor, major 7, F sharp minor 7, and F sharp. So there's a lot of versions of the tonic basically there. As well as the very unusual inclusion of chord 3, then chord 4 and chord 6. There's no use of chord 5, which is also unusual. So we have primary harmony and some secondary harmony, some extensions, and even a borrowed chord from the parallel major. It has a total vocal range of approximately an octave and a half, and a rhyme scheme of A, B, C. Some general observations. The original song was in the lower key of E minor, and it was played a bit faster. It also had a third verse, which was probably left out by the Beatles in their version because it would have made the song too long at the lower speed that they performed it at. The Beatles version has a scale-like walking bass and a complete ending with a tierce to Picardy, which is where we hear the major chord when we expected the minor, rather than that fade out. The song includes some other tricks of its day, such as a slow intro and outro and switching between ternary and binary meters, counting in 3 and counting in 4. When recording the song, Paul double-tracked his voice on the bridge, and this became a favourite recording method and trick of the Beatles and was used throughout the rest of their career. The brushwork on the drums is very neat in the Beatles recording, unlike the brushwork that we hear on the same song by Ringo in live versions recorded at the Star Club in Hamburg. And if there was any doubt that he wasn't on this album, this song more than any really gives it away. F-sharp melodic minor is used rather than the harmonic form. The melodic minor, in its ascending form, is only one note different from Dorian mode on F-sharp. So the modes were a system of scale-like structures that we used before the major-minor system that we use today and have used since the Baroque period. By omitting one note here. The composer can create a modal sounding phrase and then move back and forth between two modalities. There's the unusual use of chord 3, which is A major, on the words tasting in the verse or back in the bridge. Did this blending of minor and modal phrasing inspire the writing of And I Love Her? Because it actually has a lot of things in common. And I won't get into that now, or wait till we get to that song. But it really does have an awful lot of things in common with the structure of this song. Without understanding the ins and outs of music theory at play here, it's difficult to understand the subtlety of a composer's work, so I've tried to give an analogy. In this 1897 word ladder game written by Lewis Carroll, he passes from head to tail. And he does this by making a series of subtle changes of letter, one on each rung of the ladder. And likewise, a composer can change notes in a subtle and specific order to change tonality, shifting from major to minor to modal and back again. In one sense, it's not difficult, but in another sense, it does require knowledge and skill. And a composer could no more bluff their way through those changes than someone could complete a word ladder game like this one by merely changing random letters on each rung of the ladder and hoping for the best. Did the Beatles learn songwriting from songs like these? Or were these songs just written for them by pros? Or maybe a bit of both. The last cover on the album is Twist and Shout. The official songwriters, Phil Medley and Bert Russell. The official musicians are again the Fab Four with John on lead vocal. We're told this song was recorded in 2 takes on the 11th February 63 and mixed down on the 25th of February 63. The technical team is George Martin, Norman Smith, Richard Langham and A.B. Lincoln. The backstory. This was another favourite of the Beatles, which was regularly played in their live act. It was always left to the end of every performance because it was so vocally demanding for John that he would have little voice left to sing with afterwards. This recording was no different. It too was the last thing to be performed and recorded on the 11th February 63 for the Please Please Me album. So the key is D major. The original Isley Brothers version was in F major. Time signature 4/4. Form, intro, verse, bridge with an arpeggio build-up, another verse, then another bridge with the arpeggio build-up, and then an outro with a complete ending. It does not fade out. The phrasing is mostly regular, with some irregular phrases. So we see phrases of 4, 6, 8, 12, or 14 bars or measures. It has a total number of chords of 5, but mostly it's actually just 3. We see D major, G major, A7, A major, and D9. So in the key of D major, that represents chords 1, 4, and 5, primary harmony. And sometimes we see chord 1 and 5 extended, but there's no other more imaginative harmony. The total vocal range, again, is approximately an octave and a half, and the typical rhyme scheme is A-B, A-B. Some general observations. The Isley Brothers version was the one that the Beatles admired. Their performance was rather more laid back. It's bluesy and slightly Latin influenced in the backbeat and brass accompaniment. The Beatles version, by comparison, is full-on rock and roll. They also changed the key down from F into D major. The form is also changed by the Beatles. The Isley Brothers end this song with an extended jam over the bridge section, which then fades out. The Beatles have that wonderful vocal arpeggio at the end of the bridge, which then seamlessly flows into a short instrumental ending, and it feels really finished, much more so than the slightly static vamping of the Isley Brothers version. Despite only making the use of primary harmony, the Beatles work those chords to full extent in this song. including some beautiful antiphonal backing vocals and 3-part harmonies. They crown the song off with its only moment of secondary harmony, a fabulous D9 chord. So, a summary then. What did the Beatles learn from their cover songs? They learnt that they could adjust the speed up or down to make their version different. They learnt that changes of time signature, the use of fills, especially drum and bass, and changes to the backbeat can make a section of music sound different. They learnt that melody is constructed from a mixture of stepwise motion and leaps for interest, or it could feature repeated notes. It could switch between major, minor, and modal phrasing, and that they can adjust the key to suit their own voices. They learnt 2- and 3-part harmonies. They learnt about secondary and primary harmonies, even if they didn't realise it. They learnt extended harmonies like 7th and 9th chords. They learnt about antiphony, where parts are sung against each other or played against each other. They learnt the need to resolve phrases, and even the use of the tierce to Picardy or de Picardy third, where we hear a major chord when we expected the minor. They learnt about exchanging instruments. So, for example, there was an exchange of a saxophone for a harmonica. They learnt about form. They learnt that songs are constructed from different sections of music: intros, verses, bridges, choruses, outros, and they learnt how to fit them together and how to resolve sections and changes. They learnt about texture and dynamics, that the music can sound loud or thick or quiet and thin. When we consider the Beatles' original songs, it's reasonable to expect that they will be derivative of the songs that they covered, and that they will feature the ideas that I've just listed. And in fact they do. But the problem is that they also include many other ideas, including some pretty exotic ones. And we have to wonder, without formal training, where did those ideas come from? And we'll get into those next. So finally, we arrive at the big question. Did the Beatles write the original songs on Please Please Me? So I know what Memoirs has to say about this, and I dealt with that in my last video. We're no longer interested in that for the purposes of this video and indeed this series. Now we're interested in what the music has to tell us directly. And I'm going to analyse the original songs in the order that they were recorded, rather than the order that they might appear on the albums. So let's start at the very beginning then, with Love Me Do. Let's start by looking at the official credits for Love Me Do. So obviously the songwriters are listed as Lennon and McCartney, but the Fab Four being not quite so fab because they have Andy White on the drums, at least they do on the album version. They record actually 3 times, on the 6th of June, on the 4th of September and the 11th of September in 1962, but it's the album version in particular that we're interested in, and that was recorded after 18 takes. So this was mixed down twice, once on the 11th September and then again on the 25th of February 63. And the technical team are George Martin and Norman Smith, with A.B. Lincoln only on the mixdown session on the 25th of February 63. So the key is G major, or at least it is technically, we'll get into that. Time signature is 4/4. Form is the usual. Intro, verse, verse, bridge, verse, bridge as a solo, verse, and an outro with a fade out. The phrasing is mostly regular, largely 8 or 12 bars or measures in length, but there are some 13-bar irregular phrases, and we have to wonder at that number. 13 bars, is that an occult reference? The total number of different chords is 3. It's actually mostly just 2, being G major and C major, occasionally accompanied by D major. That represents all 3 chords from primary harmony. the combined vocal range is actually over 2 octaves. And the typical rhyme scheme is A, where everything rhymes. So the backstory. In a 1972 Hit Parader interview, John said that Love Me Do was one of the first ones we wrote. Paul started it when he must have been 15. It was one of the first we dared to do of our own. Paul, really Billy, remembers it as a 50-50 creation, although he claimed the words were his own. And who knows, maybe they really were, because we have no idea how early on Billy was involved in this project. Certainly he writes about the words for Love Me Do in Paul McCartney the Lyrics, which is the official line, or maybe the official lie. George Martin said that the Beatles insisted that their first song should be one of their own, and this was their best song at the time, which again is more of the official line. So now let's take a look at the actual score and analyse it directly. The print of the score is pocket-sized, so you might not be able to read it, but I will talk you through the highlights. And for those of you who can read music, you'll notice that the vocals are written 1 octave higher than they are performed, as is the standard procedure when writing down classical guitar. That's to get everything on 1 clef. So the first thing we note is the G major key, and this is technically true. But actually, all the F sharps that we expect to see are mostly natural. And what happens then is that the G major key is technically rendered into Mixolydian mode, which, if you're looking at a piano, is the white keys from G to G. What that also facilitates is that every time we get chord 1, which is G major, where the F naturals cut in and out, we momentarily get G7 or 1-7. So we have a momentary moment of sort of jazz or extended harmony. And we also get jazz phrasing with the triplets in the harmonica part, which is also chiefly responsible for many of those F naturals, and I've highlighted a few with little red circles. The backbeat has a shuffle feel throughout, and I suspect that's a throwback to their days as a skiffle band. All the sections start on the downbeat, and the harmonic rhythm, that is the speed that the chords change, is pretty slow. It's 1 chord per bar, but because it just goes back and forth between chord 1 and chord 4, G major, C major, G major, C major, we don't really feel like it's moving very fast. That's why I like to think of this song as a slow plod in G. And in fact, in the lyrics, Billy refers to this song as a will-o'-the-wisp of a song because it doesn't do very much. So now in the music, we're coming toward the end of that introduction, and we're told that the harmonica part was actually inspired by the song Hey Baby by Bruce Channel. And certainly if you listen to that song, you can hear that they have something in common with each other. Then the verse starts and we hear Paul accompanied by John on backing vocals, and between them they produce harmonies that are mostly in thirds and fifths with occasional sevenths, which are unusual, particularly as the sevenths here are those F naturals. The chords are unchanged. We're still moving back and forth between chord 1 and chord 4, and the shuffle feel has continued. So we're still into the verse at this point of the music, and in all honesty, there's not much more I can add that I haven't already said. So I thought I'd take this moment to say that when I first heard this song as a small child, I always really perceived it in C because it has no sharps or flats, like the key of C. And therefore, when I heard G major, C major, G major, C major, I heard it as 5-1, 5-1 in the key of C. So thinking about this song as 1-4, 1-4 in the key of G sort of slightly feels odd. And I wonder if that sort of sense of disorientation was deliberate. Just a thought. So now we're coming into the line where we hear Paul on his own. And the music is no longer Mixolydian or G major, it is now blues scale on G, which is a much more seductive sounding scale. And it's here at this moment we hear Paul spotlighted all on his own. He has an a cappella moment. All the other instruments and parts fall out. For 2 beats we only hear him before they rejoin him. But in that moment we hear him sing, "Love me do, oh, love me do." And it's like a siren call. He's literally imploring you to love him. This is Paulism 101, ground zero, first song. And I don't think that this is an accident. This seems completely contrived when we look back on it now. And what's also interesting is that in this moment of the music, we hear a false relation, which I think is also known as a cross relation. So then, at this moment, we hear Paul singing a B flat. That's part of the blues scale. But the guitar parts underneath are still playing G major, which contains a B natural. So we hear them both at the same time, just very briefly. And I always like to think of the false relation as a sort of, I don't know, like a signature. I've managed to work this incredible clashing combination of notes in, and you didn't notice. I see it in classical music all the time, by people who have very deliberately tried to work it in. Because it doesn't normally happen by accident. It's quite hard to work it in by accident. You have to really try to work it in. And for me, this is a sign that this was written by someone who was formally trained but was trying to sound naive. So it's a simple piece of music in lots of respects, but it has some of these very subtle developments. And between the Mixolydian mode, the use of the blues scale at exactly the moment when it has the greatest impact, pulling focus on Paul, where he spotlighted a cappella on his own, false relations, it's sort of beginning to stack up now. This song, in my opinion, is not the work of someone that doesn't know what they're doing. Quite the contrary. It's someone that does know what they're doing, but they're trying to sound like it's their very first effort at writing a song. So now we're coming into the bridge of the song, and we finally see chord 5. Hello, chord 5, you're very welcome relief. And we do in fact get a bit of a lift in the music as a consequence of hearing that D major chord. Then it's followed by some harmony in consecutive octaves. If you've had a formal musical education and you have spent time looking at harmony, particularly you're likely to start by the harmonization of Bach chorales, that sort of thing. And consecutive octaves are a massive no-no. There's no quicker way to make your music sound untrained and naive. But I think that that's very deliberate when we consider all of the other ideas that have already featured in this song. We're still in the bridge section here, and we see a return of those B flats that gave the bluesy feel from earlier. We also continue to see those consecutive octaves. So now we're into the harmonica solo, which has a slightly suspicious jazz rhythm to it, considering that John, who's supposedly the one playing the harmonica, really didn't like jazz. At this point, we have the full suite of primary harmony, and those F naturals continue to bring us into Mixolydian mode. Now we're at the tail end of that harmonica solo, and at this point the harmonic rhythm of the song generally is so slow that it's basically dead. We actually have 5 bars where it's just in G major and it does not move. And the only thing pushing the music along here is that jazz rhythm fill provided by the harmonica. I know you can only see 4 of those 5 bars in G major on this slide, but there's another one on the next slide. At the end of that harmonica solo, we hear the drums coming in with a little tight accent. And we're reminded, in fact, how tightly played the drums were throughout this song, because, of course, they were provided by a session player. So at the end of that solo, we get more verses and more bridges. And eventually we come to this coda, which is the outro, the ending of the song. And that blues scale vocal returns with the force relation that we had before. And then the song fades out over chords 4 and 1, just as we started. This is a naive song, and yet it has some fun and quirky moments. It's simple, but it has all these clever hidden details, and it seems so out of character for the kind of songs that the Beatles normally played. I wonder if the Beatles liked this song, and whether or not they appreciated being called its authors, if indeed, as I suspect, they were not. People tend to write songs that are derivative of the songs that they like and the sorts of songs that they would have covered. The Decca Demo original songs do fit that bill. I can imagine Hello Little Girl, Love of the Loved, Like Dreamers Do genuinely being written by John and Paul. But this song, this one doesn't seem to fit. Then, of course, there's the discussion to be had over who was actually performing. In 18 takes, I suppose it's feasible that at least 3 of the Beatles were playing. But would EMI really spend so much time trying to get it right with amateurs? Also, who is playing that harmonica? Because after about the first year's worth of the Beatles songs, we no longer see it. In fact, I don't think I can even recall a time where I've seen John Lennon post that first year of being with the Beatles, even holding a harmonica, never mind playing one. So what happened to it? In the biography of John Lennon, we're told that he was given his first harmonica to him by his uncle George as part of a bet that he won. And I would think that he would carry on playing into adulthood, especially considering that he really liked his Uncle George. P.S. I Love You. Official songwriters Lennon and McCartney. Official musicians, the Fab Four, but with Andy White still on those drums, and Ringo relegated to maracas. Recorded on the 11th of September 1962 in 10 takes, and mixed down twice, firstly on the 11th of September 62 and again for the album the 25th of February 63. Technical team, as before, George Martin, Norman Smith, and for the mixdown only, A.B. Lincoln. The backstory. This was the B-side for the single Love Me Do. There's a rumour that this is Paul's song about his then girlfriend, Dot Roan. According to John, Paul was trying to write something like the song Soldier Boy by the Shirelles, but in all honesty, I really can't hear it. Those two songs are entirely different. So we find ourselves in D major with some Aeolian phrasing. The time signature is still 4/4, and the form, the usual intro, verse, verse, bridge, verse, bridge, verse, outro with a complete ending. The phrasing is mostly regular 8-bar phrasing, but with some phrases measuring 10 or even 14 bars, both of which are irregular. There's a sum total of 8 different chords: G major, C sharp diminished, D major, A major, B minor, B flat major, C major, and E minor. So in D major, that represents chords 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, and 7, so almost the entire set of diatonic chords, everything apart from 3. We also see 2 borrowed chords from the parallel D minor of flattened 6 and flattened 7. The total vocal range is a full 2 octaves, and a typical rhyme scheme is either ABCB or AABB. So now let's take a look at the score for P.S. I Love You. So here we are on the B side of their very first single. And the thing to note straight away is that Paul has the lead vocal on both sides of this single. Supposedly, at this point in history, the Beatles are John's band, yet Paul has the lead vocal on both sides of their first single. And I really wonder what John Lennon must have been thinking, because, I mean, literally by his own admission, he was a jealous guy, no pun intended, and I can't imagine that he was terribly happy. But anyway, here we are. We're in the key of D major, and we immediately get a chord stream looped. Chord 4, chord 7, which is quite impressive, and chord 1. You can use chord 7 quite easily in some genres more than others, certainly jazz, and in this case a more sort of Latin pop sort of a song. Chord 7 here is sort of taking the place of what would probably be chord 5. Chord 5 in D major is A major, so this C sharp diminished chord shares 2 of those 3 notes in those triads. So it's close enough to fill the same gap, but just different enough to create some tension. So when we have these 3 chords looped, as we do here, then we are creating tension and releasing it, creating it and releasing it over and over. The guitar riff is also very hypnotic. The drums and the bass also provide a sort of begin rhythm, and in other places a tango rhythm, so they also add to the Latin feel. The other thing to note is that the introduction here is both vocal as well as instrumental, which is unusual, because normally they play songs where there's an instrumental introduction before the vocals come in. Either way, the music is quite trance-like. We almost feel like we're being lulled into something, as the boys sing to us in unison. So as we get to the end of that intro and into the verse, the harmonies become thicker and we hear accented harmonies on the beats, as though to underline the important words of the sentence. We also see these lovely stepwise rises and falls in the melody. It makes it feel like it has a lilt, like it's undulating, like water. As we get more into the verse here, we see that most of the phrases start on the beat, but a few of them anticipate it. And this is almost like an excited teenager that can't wait for something to start, so they actually start prematurely. We also see some wonderful harmonies. We see the beginning of some borrowed chords. We see flattened 6, and in a moment we'll see flattened 7. These are very romantic sort of harmonic devices, the sorts of things that we see in Neapolitan songs. They're also found in jazz, including Latin jazz, of which this is not too dissimilar. But the Beatles weren't jazz fans, so we have to wonder why these sorts of chords have been included. And here again we see that flattened chord 7 going into chord 1, so that the harmony resolves very neatly. We see some very tight 2 and 3 part vocal harmonies, with Paul's lead line highlighted on the beats. This is a sweet and soppy story song, of which the Beatles will become noted, most especially Paul, regardless of whoever actually wrote them. The point is that it becomes a template for other songwriters. As we go into the bridge, we actually at that point realise that the intro we heard at the beginning was a variant of this bridge. so that neatly ties the two together. And in the bridge we also see some nice ad-libbed vocal solo moments on top of that lovely thick three-part harmony. At the end of this verse we also see a perfect cadence. We see one half here, the chord 5, and here at the beginning we see the chord 1. That's two parts of the perfect cadence. Perfect cadence is essentially the musical equivalent of a full stop or period. So as we go into a new section here, this is a variant of the verse, we see a brief return to primary harmony and some stepwise movement in the bass sequences. We see 1, 2, 1, and then 5, 6, 5 in the chord progressions. They're very beautiful chord progressions. Likewise, earlier we saw 1, 5, 1. The effect of moving to a chord and then back to the one you were previously at is that the music feels like it's swirling. It adds to that sense of being mesmerized by the music, especially when it's an idea that gets repeated. But of course it's very subtle. You're being manipulated by the music, but you don't notice. So after that previous chord 5, we now get chord 6, so that we hear an interrupted cadence, otherwise known as a deceptive cadence. And as the name suggests, it feels abrupt and quite surprising. It's then followed again by chord 5, and it feels like we're moving into a new key, perhaps A major. But then we don't. We actually move into a new mode instead, because the F sharp and C sharp from the key signature of D major drop out, a B flat is added, and now we're in Aeolian mode on D, otherwise known as D natural minor. And that in turn allows us to have these borrowed chords from D minor, aka Aeolian mode on D. So now we have a new chord stream, flat and 6, flat and 7, and chord 1. This is all really surprising. We didn't really expect to hear any of this, and the most surprising thing of all is that we just heard the diatonic form of chord 6, and then we hear the flattened form borrowed from the parallel minor. And so we're quite delighted. The ear is quite surprised to hear these things side by side. And now, finally, with all the verses and bridges completed, we find ourselves at the end. And really that ending is just the last part of the verse extended and looped into an outro. And again we see here the chord stream loops on those borrowed chords, flat and 6, flat and 7, 1, with that stepwise bass movement underneath. And we're still using that Aeolian phrasing. It's worth noting that the use of flat and 6 and flat and 7 chords didn't really become popular in pop or rock or even love ballads until after the Beatles made it popular. They were not the people who invented it. These are devices we see very, very frequently in romantic piano music, that is, from the Romantic period. We see them in jazz also. But in mainstream pop, really, I would say it's the Beatles that made them popular. And now it's standard fare to use these chords in a love ballad. Sometimes it's hard to see the thread through musical history because a thing becomes so common that we no longer regard it as special. But if we go back to when it started to be used, we can see the influence, in this case from the Beatles, looking back on it. The song ends with a non-standard cadence, going from chord 7 in its flattened form to chord 1. So it feels very abrupt. The music swells and then suddenly stops. But this abruptness and those slightly exotic chord choices are in keeping with the style of the song. And the song still feels fully finished because we've made it back to our home key and chord 1. This song and its arrangement is quite a bizarre choice for the B-side of their first single. It doesn't matter which song you think was the better, Love Me Do or P.S. I Love You. The fact remains that of the two, this was the more complicated, the more sophisticated. So, some might wonder, why it was relegated to the B-side, particularly if Love Me Do was considered the best that they could do, because it clearly wasn't. This was a more sophisticated piece of music, regardless of whether or not you like it. Of course, that's if the narrative were true, which I don't believe it was. This song is also a slightly odd blend of thinking backwards and forwards, because in some ways it's a throwback to the kind of songs we heard on the Decca demo, those sorts of songs that they performed back then, but also because of the harmony. It's looking forward. It's actually beginning to set new trends in the kind of harmony we're going to expect in mainstream pop and rock and roll. And because of that, we have to question whether or not the Beatles were really capable of writing something like this. Please Please Me. Official songwriters Lennon and McCartney. Official musicians, the Fab Four, with John on lead vocals plus that harmonica. Originally recorded on the 11th of September 62, but the version that was put out was the one from 26th of November 1962 in 18 takes. Mixing again on the 30th of November 62, that was for the single, and again on the 25th of February 63 for the album. The technical team, George Martin, Norman Smith, and for that mixdown for the album, A.B. Lincoln. The backstory. John said that this was his attempt to write a song that sounded like Roy Orbison's Only the Lonely. Another influence was the Everly Brothers song Cathy's Clown. Please, a Bing Crosby song, was the title of a song that John's mother, Julia, used to sing to him. The double meaning of the word please was said to have delighted John. Maybe so, but it also reminds us of Aleister Crowley's direction to say two things at once. George Martin claimed that he had to get them to speed up the song in order to pep it up. So, we find ourselves again in the key of E major, with a time signature of 4/4. The form: intro, verse, verse, bridge, verse, and outro with a complete ending. The phrases are mostly regular, either 4, 8, or 12 bars, but occasionally with 14 bars, which is irregular. There is a total of 7 different chords: E major, A major, G major, B major, F sharp minor, C sharp minor, and C major. So in the key of E major, that represents chords 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6, with some borrowed harmony from E minor for the flattened chord 3 and the flattened chord 6. The combined vocal range is an octave and a half. And a typical rhyme scheme would be AABC, but the middle 8 is AABCCD. Now let's take a look at the score for Please Please Me. This was the Beatles' second single, but their first to be number 1 in the UK, and in compositional terms it was a quantum leap forward from their first single Love Me Do. But of course, we've already seen a leap forward in their songwriting skills, and we saw that in P.S. I Love You, the B-side to Love Me Do. And now with their second single, Please Please Me, we can see another leap forward. They just keep getting better and better, and all in the space of just a few weeks. So, here we find ourselves in E major. We have pickup notes on beat 4. Remember, the psychology of starting before the beginning of the bar is that we're so eager to start, we've started early. So we seriously mean business here. And then we hear that harmonica and guitar obbligato that forms the backbone of this introduction. We have a rock backbeat. The Latin rhythms are gone. We now mean rock and roll business, with little drum fills and accents wherever appropriate, as a sort of marker between sections. This is a quick song. It always drives forwards. It's generally loud, has thick textures, especially in the vocals. When the vocals for the verse start, we hear a scale-like melody that starts on beat 2. And yet the music doesn't sound like it's arrived late. If anything, the vocals sound like they're even more keen than they were before. It's not so much that the vocals are 1 beat late, but rather it feels like they're 3 beats early. As we move steadily into the verse, the most standout ideas can be found in those vocal harmonies. John sings the lead line, which repeatedly cascades down through the E major scale. Meanwhile, Paul sings above him, staying on that same E. And Paul's discant harmony here, in fact, forms a pedal note on E. The constant changing of interval between them is like a waterfall of sounds cascading over the ear. It's meant to denote an outpouring of frustration, in this case, sexual frustration. The melody is falling by step and then rises upwards again in the guitar obbligato, aided by that flattened 3 chord. When the vocal returns, it cascades back down again, so the melody rides up and down like a roller coaster ride. The harmony here is mostly primary, but due to the speed of all of those interval changes and the relentless driving of the rhythm, it is never dull. And in the case of that borrowed flattened 3 chord from E natural minor, we are never far away from some sort of harmonic trick. We then realise that the first 2 phrases of the verse are in fact linked together through a little instrumental break and actually form a sort of couplet. We're well into the verse by this point, and this is the second time we hear a plagal cadence. Now, a cadence is like a sort of musical punctuation, and chord 4 to chord 1 is a plagal cadence, which is the kind of cadence we would normally associate with the end of a hymn. So it seems sort of a bit odd to hear it in a rock or pop tune, and especially one with this kind of speed and drive and excitement. The character of this song is, frankly, the opposite to that of a hymn. And this sort of rewrites what can be done with the plagal cadence, because we don't really perceive it as being even present, and yet it fits exactly. Then we hear another quick instrumental break that doesn't slow the pace of the song at all. The drums have a new syncopated rhythm here, which adds more excitement as we approach the end of the verse. After the instrumental break, we are, quite literally, given the come on. Come on, come on, come on, come on. The call and response between the lead and backing vocal harmonies pleads at us using 4ths, 5ths and 6ths, which is very beautiful but also very effective. We have a sort of story here in the arrangement, in that the arrangement of the music reflects the story of the song. There's a sort of conflict of head and heart. We have ascending sequences in those vocals and the bass that eventually lead to chord 1, so it has a sort of resolution at the end, a climax if you will. But the inner guitar part has this 2-note chromatic figure. Doesn't really want to move, like a sort of reluctant partner. There is, on the whole, quite a lot of psychological mimicry of the sexual act, but also the interplay between the characters of this song, and we see that repeatedly in the actual arrangement. So now we find ourselves at the top of those ascending sequences, with the bass line still moving upwards because it had a delayed start. We have been treated to some call and response in the vocals, followed by some close 3-part harmony work over those rising and then falling chords and bass line. Meanwhile, that lead melody is often found between the harmony parts. And this is especially heard on the words "I please you" at the end of the verses to almost underline the meaning of those words. We then turn into a perfect cadence to round the end of those verses off. We then have a recap of the obbligato from the introduction, and then realise that that obbligato is the link between this verse and into the next one. Or, as the second time bar indicates, it will take us into the bridge, in which case we then hear a drum fill as we go into the bridge. So now we find ourselves in the bridge. This song is loud and fast and thick in texture. It's a full tilt song. But the exception is the bridge, which is a bit thinner and quieter to contrast the verses. There's lots of subtle details in the song that could be said to mimic the sexual act. The fast rising lead vocal melodies and harmonic sequences are definitely chief among them, but so too is the melody line seen here in the bridge, constructed from a repeated chromatic idea, moving back and forth between two notes whilst the backing vocals rise behind it, eventually climaxing and falling back into another perfect cadence. It's something of a signature of a John Lennon song, to have this sort of stepwise movement in the melody over a very narrow range of notes, often moving just up and down between two notes, as we see here. The consecutive fifths in the harmony during the bridge section offer some sense of naivety carried forward from Love Me Do. And yet most of the rest of the harmony in this song is much more sophisticated, so this seems a little jarring. The constant movement in the bass part provides an exciting lilt for the ear, and here we particularly see a rising and falling figure in the bass as we come to the end of the bridge. This song never rests for a second of its 2-minute duration, and by the end we are left wanting more, which I suppose is the point. Towards the end of the bridge, we see an octave leap on the word you. It's so hard to reason with you. It's like pointing a finger at the girl in question. It's so hard to reason with you basically translates into, why won't you sleep with me? And it's underlined with that big octave leap. The backing vocal harmonies also are in sixths here as they fall back down into the line, why do you make me blue? And then finish with another perfect cadence. Once again, we see that obbligato that we originally saw in the intro and has linked between all of the sections so far. At the end of the bridge, we see an imperfect cadence, which neatly links us back into the final verse. So finally, we arrive at the outro. The musicologist Alan Pollack compared this ending to that of a hocket, which is a usually French medieval part song, which I think is a bit of an exaggeration, but I can sort of understand what he means. In a hocket, if you can imagine a group of singers that have a melody that is essentially cut up into jigsaw fragments and then distributed among the group at random, so that when they sing the melody between them, it moves randomly back and forth between the singers, but that you as a listener only hear one continuous melody. It's the ultimate act in having faith in your fellow musicians, because if anyone is even just a tiny bit late, it ruins the entire effect. And here we see a melody with 3-part harmony and antiphonal lines that cut in and out of each other. It does, I suppose, have a similar effect, but it's not nearly as impressive. We once again see for the final time that harmonica and guitar obbligato that has been with us since the very beginning. In fact, it's been with us since the intro. At this point, the music is faster and more frenetic now, and we're playing right up to the very end where we get that very tight drum fill with accents. It's a complete and full ending. Anything else would have been a washout, considering the relentless drive of this song from the very start all the way to the end. But of course, as we drive towards the finish, there's always time for one more harmonic trick, and we see 2 last borrowed chords, flattened 3 and flattened 6, that then turn into a final perfect cadence. It sounds fully finished. It's 2 minutes of pure crafted pop. The idea that this could have been written by an amateur is frankly ridiculous. The harmony work, particularly for the vocal parts, shows sign of authorship by somebody who knew choral work, particularly Baroque-styled choral work. So the idea that this could have been written by an amateur I find laughable. Ask Me Why. Official songwriters Lennon and McCartney. Official musicians, the Fab Four, with John on lead vocals. Recorded originally on the 6th of June 62 as part of their EMI test recordings, and again on the 26th of November 1962 for the B-side of their second single, Please Please Me. It is recorded in 6 takes. The mixdown is on the 30th of November 62 for that single, and the technical team is George Martin, Norman Smith, and Chris Neal. So the backstory. This was the B-side for the single version of Please Please Me. Ask Me Why was supposedly performed during the Beatles' EMI audition on the 6th of June 1962. So we have to wonder, how early were they gifted this song? Because I don't believe they wrote it. In many ways, Ask Me Why is P.S. I Love You Part 2. It shares quite a lot in common with that song, but it's more sophisticated. I don't think they wrote P.S. I Love You, and I don't think they wrote Ask Me Why either. Although it's officially a Lennon and McCartney song, the songwriting is attributed to John, which seems quite odd to me, because I can imagine that John would describe this as an example of Paul's granny music. It has a lot of jazz, including Latin jazz influences, which I cannot really see the Beatles particularly being interested in, especially John, who we know for sure did not like jazz. This song is said to be based on Smokey Robinson and the Miracle song, What's So Good About Goodbye, but I can't hear the influence in this song. So again, we find ourselves in the key of E, and with a time signature of 4/4. The form is the fussiest we've seen so far. Intro, verse in its initial form, verse variant 1, bridge, verse variant 2, and then verse in the initial form again, verse in the variant 2 form again, another bridge, and then an outro with a complete ending. It has a mixture of regular and irregular phrasing. So we see phrases and sections of 2, 4, 6, 9, and 12 bars or measures in length. The total number of chords is an impressive 12. E major, E7, F sharp minor 7, G sharp minor 7, G sharp 7, C sharp minor, A minor, E augmented, A major, B major, F sharp 9, and A over E. In E major, that constitutes chords 1, 1, 7, 1 augmented, 2, 7, 3, 7, 4, including sometimes heard in its second inversion form, and chord 5. We also see a brief move to C sharp minor, where we hear chord 1, chord 4, 4, 9, and 5, 7. The combined vocal range is an octave and a half, and a typical rhyme scheme is either AABB or AABC. So let's look at the score for Ask Me Why. So we find ourselves yet again in E major. I'm willing to bet that whoever wrote this song also wrote P.S. I Love You, as I said before. Now, P.S. I Love You had no instrumental introduction. This song does, but it's super brief. It's just 6 beats, or a bar and a half. And that little syncopated introduction is really only there to serve to establish the key as being E, because here we are in chord 1. The phrases start halfway through the bar and have a sort of Latin jazz or dance pop feel, and we also see the presence of chord streams, the backing vocals of which add sevenths to those chords. So although I've written 1, 2, and 3, it's actually 1, 7, 2, 7, and 3, 7, with a rising stepwise bass to support those chord streams. All the rhythms are syncopated, especially in the guitar parts throughout the piece. And there's a stepwise melody that gently rises and falls, with a shape much like speech. In fact, the whole song is essentially an intimate conversation between two people. We also see some other traits to add to that pseudo-Latin feel. a sort of V-shaped triplet figure, although this could also be doo-wop inspired. So now we're well into the first verse, and essentially it's the same as the opening. Again, we have those chord streams with the added sevenths in the backing vocals and that rising bass line. But in addition, we have a new syncopated rhythm in the guitar parts and also some guitar arpeggiations. In the second half of the verse, we see a very subtle key change into C sharp minor. And but for that single instance of a B sharp, we would never know that it's even happened. And I've put the B sharp inside a red circle here. You'll note that I've written the chords in both E major and C sharp minor. And that's because the chords that have been chosen through this section, the second part of the verse, have been chosen so that they actually fit into both keys. So therefore we get this very ambiguous sense of what key we're in. And as I say, it's only because of the B sharp that we see in the beginning of the line here that we know we're in C sharp minor at all. The bass line also changes into a tango-inspired bass line. There are more guitar arpeggiations and some rhythms in the guitar parts that are sort of a hybrid of a beguine and a bossa nova. At times we see that the harmony parts that the backing vocals supply are quite sparse, and at times they're absent altogether, so that John's voice on the lead vocal is exposed. And I wonder actually if that was by accident. I wonder if the boys didn't quite manage to sing all of the harmony that they were supposed to. So here on the left-hand side of the screen we can see the end of the first verse as it turns into the second verse. On the right-hand side we see the bridge, which we'll deal with in a moment. So at the end of the verse we see the vocal shoots up on the word blue, and this upward rise extends the average vocal range of the lead line, which is about an octave, by another half octave. And in fact, this is a trait. We see unusual jazzy chords as well at these passionate moments. For example, here we see this 4-9 chord, F sharp 9. Those chord streams come back in. I haven't fully fleshed them out, but the music is turning back into the second verse, which starts much the same as the first one. And then on the right hand side we have the bridge. So the bridge fills a silence with an E augmented chord 1. It also has a new syncopated rhythm, which is slightly more inspired by a bossa nova, and we see that B sharp that we saw before borrowed from the C sharp minor key, even though we are now back in E major. This gives us the sense that we will return to C sharp minor later on in the song, which of course we do. So now we're still in the middle of the bridge, and finally we see some primary harmony. And because it hasn't been used very much, it now sounds quite strange and exotic to our ears, when normally it sounds quite plain. But of course, that augmented chord, E augmented, which is used to fill a silence between the phrases, is never far away to add an exotic lift to the harmony. The backing vocals are also used to highlight certain words. And underneath all of that, we have the syncopated fills from the guitar parts and a gently rising and falling bass line, which rocks and lulls us into a sense of warm and peaceful security. Here we are at the end of the bridge, and we see a little obligato fill in the instrumental parts before the music turns into variant 2 of the verse. Again, we see those chord streams we saw before, accompanied by yet another syncopated rhythm in the guitar parts, this time something more beguine inspired as we had before. Here we see the end of the variant 2 form of the verse and the beginning of the return of the initial form of the verse, We see the introduction that we had right at the very beginning reused and utilized as an obligato to separate those sections and perform a sort of turnaround. On the very far right-hand side of the screen, we see coda 1, which marks the end of the second bridge. It's on that word blue with the high leap and that F-sharp 9 chord. As we come to the end of variant 2 of the verse and again into the bridge for the final time, we see that stepwise motion across the parts on the words "Ask Me Why." We've always seen it every time we've heard these words, but here the texture is so much thicker. Note also the looped use of chord 3/7 into 4. 3/7 is being used as a substitute for chord 1, since 3 of its 4 notes also belong to chord 1, so that's a very clever use of substitution. And an excellent way to sneak in a chord that is notoriously difficult to utilize. So we finally made it to the outro, which is essentially the last verse idea extended and looped. The bass and guitar rhythms are unaltered here as the chords change via inversion. Here we have chord 4/7C, that's the second inversion of chord 4, then 1, then 4/7C, and then finally we end on that 3/7 chord. Firstly, it is a secondary seventh that we've seen plenty of times in this song before, but the use of this chord at the very end is particularly interesting, because the reason why it works as a substitute for chord 1 is also because of its relationship via the dominant. So we're in the key of E. The dominant is the 5th note of that scale, which is B. The relative minor of B is G sharp, and here we have G sharp minor 7. So it does actually have a relationship back to E major. And that's why it doesn't just sound like some random chord, even though it quite easily could have done. And then finally, we hear those guitar arpeggiations drawing us gently to a close. We have to wonder why songs like Ask Me Why and P.S. I Love You were included as B-sides and on their first album. I wonder if it's because they are throwbacks to the kinds of music they had to play at their early dance hall gigs. I saw her standing there. Official songwriters Lennon and McCartney. Official musicians, the Fab Four, with Paul on lead vocals. Recorded the 11th of February 1963. The basic song required 6 takes, but the overdubs, mostly referencing the hand claps, pushed this up to 12 takes. It was recorded on a 2-track recorder and bounced down into a second 2-track recorder for the overdubs. Paul's spoken word count-in from take 9 was spliced onto take 12 with the overdubbed hand claps. This added to the effect of the Beatles playing live. Mixdown was on the 25th of February 63, and the technical team was George Martin, Norman Smith, Richard Langham, and A.B. Lincoln. The backstory. There are conflicting stories about this song's origin. One story says that Paul wrote it on a Zenith Model 17 in July of 1962. Supposedly, it was written about Rory Storm's sister Iris Cadwell, who was Paul's girlfriend at the time. The second story says that it was written in Rory Storm's house on the 22nd of October 1962, with lyrics written by Paul 2 days later during a visit to London with Celia Mortimer, who was also claimed to have been Paul's girlfriend at that time. It was not finished until a month later, this time at Paul's house in Forthlin Road, with help from John. With so many conflicting stories, it's difficult to know what to believe. Either this is a sign that Paul did not write this song, or it's a sign that he had a lot of girlfriends. Unbelievably, it's said to be based on the traditional folk song 17 Come Sunday, although I really cannot hear it. But what is really interesting is that this song does contain a lot of modal phrasing, in exactly the way we would expect to hear in a folk song. The first reference to the song being played live was in a recording at the Cavern Club at the end of 1962. It also features in their Star Club set in Hamburg from December of 1962. Either way, it means this song was recorded live after the Beatles were signed to EMI, so the song still could have been written for them. But equally, it could have been plagiarised, since the bass line and chords were lifted straight from Chuck Berry's I'm Talking About You from 1961. So once again, we find ourselves in the key of E, although other scales with a tonal centre on E are used, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The time signature once again is 4/4. The form: introduction, verse, verse, bridge, verse as a solo, bridge, verse, and outro with a complete ending. It doesn't fade out. The phrase and section lengths are mostly regular, with some irregular phrasing. Mostly we see 4 or 8 bar phrases, with sometimes 10 bar phrases. The total number of chords is 5, but really it's only 4, since one of them is inverted. We see E7, A7, B7, E7 over G sharp, with the G sharp really emphasized, and C major. So in E major, that represents chords 1/7, which we sometimes hear inverted, 4/7, 5/7, and a flattened chord 6 taken from the parallel minor of E minor. The combined vocal range is almost 2.5 octaves, although partly this is due to the presence of a couple of randomly high notes. The typical rhyme scheme: A, A, B, C, B. So now let's look at the score for I Saw Her Standing There. This song starts with a count-in, which makes us feel like we're really hitting the ground running. Then we find we're back in the familiar key of E. Stylistically, it's a breakaway from their post-skiffle sound and constitutes one of their first rockers. The dynamics and texture are thick, loud, and raucous. This is an up-tempo song with much syncopation in the vocals and lead guitar parts. Typically, the phrases begin with pickup notes before the downbeat, which gives the listener the impression of an impetuous youth bouncing through his life at his own whim. Primary harmony is used throughout, but all of those chords have added sevenths, so we hear chord 1/7, 4/7, 5/7, and this made me think not only of the song Boys, which we talked about earlier, but also the influence of someone like Tony Sheridan, who I know when I researched him. He was very, very keen on the use of sevenths, because as someone with formal training, he understood how incredibly useful they are. We see some modal phrasing because of those D naturals, and I've shown one example here of a Mixolydian phrase highlighted with a red bracket. This modal phrasing is in no small part directly related to the use of these sevenths, because that added seventh is the same D natural note. There's a boogie-woogie feel in the guitar and bass. There's syncopation in the lead guitar rhythm, and quite a lot of frenetic movement in the bass and rhythm guitar. All of these rhythmic aspects add to the excitement of the song right from the off. And that's important because on the actual album, this is the first track, so they start as they mean to carry on. The melody is stepwise with occasional leaps, and that's interesting because this will become a trait. Paul's songs, whoever actually wrote them, tend to gently roam through a wider range of pitch. They ebb and flow and maybe even have a lilt. They have a somewhat traditional melody, reminiscent of the shape of a ballad or show tune. John's songs, again, whoever wrote them, are characterized by a narrow range of notes. Often there are repetitions on one note, or they move back and forth between a couple of neighbouring notes, with some occasional leaps, maybe even an octave. In short, they were opposites, but I suppose by being opposites, 1, they complemented each other, stylistically speaking, and 2, it attracted the widest range of people, people who were into the more traditional sort of melodies, and people who were into more extreme forms of melody writing. Again here we see in the phrasing a mixture of Mixolydian and Dorian phrasing. So where we merely have the D's natural, most of which I've highlighted here in little red circles, that's where we see Mixolydian phrasing. But when the G natural joins it, we also hear Dorian phrasing. And yet, despite having all this modal phrasing, the phrases actually sound bluesy rather than modal in a, say, Renaissance or medieval sense. They also bend into those naturals, and that's part of the bluesy feel of this piece. The rhythmic and harmonic aspects also contribute to its bluesy feel, but so does the fact that the melodic line still considers E to be home. There is a subtle skill and art on display here. If the phrasing considered G to be the home note, as it would do in Mixolydian mode, or it considered D to be the home note, as it would do in Dorian mode, then it would sound more medieval or Renaissance inspired. But here the home note is always E. And because of that, it sounds more modern, more contemporary. It sounds like we haven't truly left E major. We're further into the verse here, and on the line, "How could I dance with another?" we see an example, I've shown in a red bracket, of a Dorian phrase. We also see some bending on the pickup notes, which again gives it a bluesy feel. On the climax of the line, "How could I dance with another, oh, when I saw her standing there?" on that word oh, we see that flattened chord 6, which is just C major. And ordinarily, C major is a terribly plain chord. But here is an example of how context makes all the difference in music. This C chord is special because we weren't expecting it. We've had a progressive loss of more and more sharps. First, we've lost the D sharps. That made the phrasing Mixolydian. Then we lost the G sharps. That made the phrasing Dorian. And now we've even lost the C sharps. Technically now the only sharp remaining is the F, and we're actually in G. And all of those changes have paved the way for that C chord to now take place without sounding jarring. And when we do finally hear that C chord, we find that it's been placed in the focal point of this phrase at the rhythmically most interesting place, just before we hear the title of the song. So there's nothing accidental about its position here. What I find especially interesting is to note that the sharps were removed in the reverse order of the key signature, implying a knowledge of the key signature and therefore some kind of knowledge of music theory, even if that's only in the very practical and hands-on sense in the way that most jazz musicians do. So here we're at the end of the verse and we're entering into the bridge. And as we do so, we hear offbeat accents in the lead guitar. And again, some more Dorian phrasing at the beginning of that bridge. And underneath, in the rhythm guitar part, we see this chromatic movement back and forth between C natural and C sharp. So again, even though the phrasing on top in the vocal part is Dorian, underneath we have this ambiguity. We don't quite know what key we're in. That chromaticism does add colour, but it also plays with the E major, E minor feel to this song. And it makes us feel slightly disorientated. This is like a constant shifting of sand. The ear is trying to work out what key we're in, but it moves so quickly and so subtly that the music continually delights and surprises us. And in a way, this sort of reminds me of the kind of Baroque keyboard or choral work that someone like J.S. Bach would have written. And I'm not suggesting in any shape or form that this song sounds Baroque, but I'm saying that it does take ideas that I would associate with that period. In particular, a constant and subtle shifting of tonality and modality. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's where the seed of the idea came from. in the bridge is where we hear the words, "When I crossed that room and held her hand in mine." There's a typo there, it says mind, it should be mine. And we hear syncopation in this lead vocal, with sometimes accents on and then off the beat, the accents falling where the words rhyme to reinforce them. Again, we've got that chromatic figure underneath, sort of broken chord figure, where the C is sometimes natural and sometimes sharp. And underneath that, at the end on the word mine, we hear that fantastic falsetto that goes across into the next slide. This is at the very end of the bridge. We still hear that falsetto sustained and gently shifting up. And I do wonder sometimes whether the Beatles, who had this incredible ability to sing in a high enough register that their female fans, which constituted most of their fans, could easily sing along. And I wonder if that's not an accident. Because from the point of view of the psychology of this psyop, if you have a band producing music that the audience can easily interact with, the audience will feel a greater sense of bonding with the music, but also with the band. Because Paul and John's falsetto singing is not in any shape or form effeminate. They just sound like men who can sing high. Firstly, that's quite remarkable because of its rarity. And secondly, it's important to the psyop because the Beatles were meant to represent a sort of dream sexual fantasy for the girls that followed them. So I think maybe that's one of the reasons they were chosen to be part of this psyop. At the end of this bridge section, we see the melody stepping down into the verse with a little drum accent or fill underneath, linking the sections. To the right of this slide, you'll see where a verse goes into the new verse, which is actually the guitar solo. And here we see the vocal with a big leap of a tenth, which is very impressive. This is like a linking section into the guitar solo, where we see this imperfect cadence. Most of the cadences have been imperfect or perfect at this point, and they've been whichever one made sense, demonstrating an understanding of the way that cadences are used as musical punctuation. So here we see another false relation between the lead guitar and the rhythm guitar. The lead guitar has a phrase here that contains G naturals, but underneath it, the rhythm guitar is playing G sharps. So between them, they create very brief, passing false relations or cross relations. And we saw this in Love Me Do. I tend to think of the false relation as being a bit like a musical Easter egg, but something we'd more typically see in classical music. You're not really meant to hear it, you're meant to hunt for it. Sort of like the composers put it in for you to find, but you're not meant to immediately hear it. Immediately hearing it means that the composer didn't really know what to do with it. Again, the lead guitar solo contains Dorian phrasing, but also additionally, to add to that bluesiness, we see B flats taken from E blues scale. We're still in the guitar solo here, and we can see a sweeping arced shape, upwards and then downwards again, in this guitar solo. A lot of syncopation, a lot of grace notes too, which adds to the sort of bluesy feel, and there's a driving bass rhythm on the root notes underneath, which links the chords with a stepwise movement. So here we come to the end section of that guitar solo, much the same as before, and still with that Dorian phrasing, but with the syncopation and the grace notes that give it a bluesy feel. It ends with that drum fill with the accents and goes back into the next verse with another imperfect cadence. On the far right here, this last bar or measure on the right hand side, this is a linking bar into the final verse. And it's subtly different to accommodate the change in words that we saw at the start of each verse. Here we are in the final verse. It's much the same as before, except it uses fewer chords. And because the music has been moving so quickly in terms of the harmony and its tonality, this held E7, 1/7 chord that we now see here makes us feel like we're in suspense. There's a sort of tension because we expect it to move quickly like it has done before, but now it isn't. So there's a surprise from the tension because we didn't get what we had now by this point become accustomed to. And here we are at the very, very end. So we're back in that mixolydian mode as we started. We have the drum fills and accents, a rising arpeggio, and a plagal cadence, which could sound hymn-like, but it's actually quite rocky. So again, as we saw before, we're taking ideas that could sound very, very different, and we're transporting them into a completely different sound. Misery. Official songwriters, Lennon and McCartney. Official musicians, the Fab Four with John on lead vocals. Recorded the 11th of February 1963 in 11 takes. Mixed down on the 25th of February 1963. Technical team, George Martin, Norman Smith, Stuart Eltham, Richard Langham, A.B. Lincoln, and Jeff Emmerich. The backstory. John and Paul were said to have written this while they were backstage at their own concert at King's Hall in Stoke-on-Trent. They wanted to get the teen sensation Helen Shapiro to cover it, thinking that it would be a coup for them as a songwriting team. But Helen's manager, Norrie Paramore, vetoed the song, which is interesting because Norrie also worked for EMI as a producer in a parallel role from George Martin. Helen was later rather annoyed that she hadn't been given the opportunity, but of course, that was after their fame totally eclipsed hers. If she had have recorded this song, she would have actually been the first artist to have covered a Beatles song. George Harrison apparently struggled with the guitar riff that accompanied the line, "I'll remember all the little things we've done." So, on the 20th of February, George Martin decided to replace those guitar parts with a piano solo that he provided himself. He asked Norman Smith to record the song at twice the normal speed so that he could overdub his solo at half speed, meaning that the finished result would sound normal in terms of the pitch, but the tonal quality of the piano would be closer to that of a harpsichord. And George Martin would go on to use this trick many times, perhaps most notably on the song In My Life in 1965. So we find ourselves in C major and in 4/4. The form, introduction, verse, verse, bridge, verse, verse as a solo, bridge, verse, and an outro with a complete ending, so no fade out. The phrasing is mostly regular, but with some irregular phrasing at both the introduction and the outro. So mostly we see 8-bar phrases, but a couple of 5-bar phrases as well. The total number of chords is 5, F major, G major, A minor, C major, and G7. In C major, that corresponds to chords 1, 4, 5, 5, 7, and 6, so it's completely diatonic. The combined vocal range is only an octave and a half, and the typical rhyme scheme is AAB. So let's look at the score for Misery. This, rather like Love Me Do, is another example of that pseudo-acoustic skiffle sound. And the key is C, but we don't actually hear that chord 1, until the 6th bar. We actually start with F. So we've actually started on chord 4. This makes the home key note of C seem remote. The song begins with that arpeggiation on the piano that's been made to sound like a harpsichord because of the recording technique, so it immediately has a slightly baroque feel. It has this unusual slow introduction in 6/8 that then speeds up and moves into 4/4, so it's only in 6/8 for literally 2 bars. And in fact, as we move from 6/8 into 4/4, we actually have this partial chromatic scale moving upward. The Beatles sing the opening lines in unison, apart from at the phrase endings where they break into two-part harmony. On the word misery, we hear a saraband-inspired rhythm, dotted crotchet, quaver, crotchet. The song is not in any shape or form related to the saraband, which is a slow, stately dance in triple time, but that specific rhythm is associated with the saraband, which is normally a slow, stately dance in triple time and forms part of a classic Baroque dance suite, and is typically more sombre in style, and so very appropriate for the word misery. And indeed, we see the word misery with this rhythm repeated throughout this song. So finally we see chord 1, and then we see chord 1 and chord 4 back and forth in exactly the same way that we did in Love Me Do. We're still singing in unison here, and although the song is about being in misery, it actually sounds more like they're in the terraces at Anfield. They sound far too jolly to be in misery, so in that sense it doesn't work at all. Also, let's remember the backstory. John and Paul were said to have written this for Helen Shapiro to sing. So why is the first lyric, "I'm the kind of guy who never used to cry"? That sounds like it was written for a man rather than a girl, now doesn't it? So the backstory is crumbling already. The short, fragmented nature of the phrasing here is also really interesting. And also, we typically see that the phrasing starts before the downbeat. And this is a well-known technique that we can date back to at least the Renaissance. If you're trying to write a song which reflects, in this case, being in misery, then you'd want the phrasing to be fragmented in the same way that someone's speech would be if they had been crying so hard that they'd been sobbing. You think about how difficult it is to speak when you've been crying really hard, and we especially see this in children. Their sobs literally stop them from being able to speak in one continuous flowing sentence. And that's what's being done here. The fragmented nature of the phrasing reflects that of someone who is so miserable that their sobs break up their speech into fragments. The melody here is pentatonic, and it rises and falls gently. There's also a shuffle feel to the drums, and quite a simple bass, so it feels like it just sort of very gently skips along. The guitar part here plays a figure during the F chord that contains a D, which I've highlighted with little red circles. When we add that D onto the F chord, we create an added sixth, and that adds a jazzy feel to the music. So here, as we're getting into the verse, we have a shuffle drum pattern, which is quite hypnotic. On top of that, we have a syncopated bass line. We then start to hear chord 6 for the first time, and we'll hear it quite a few times as we get into the song. It's being used as a surrogate for chord 4, since they share 2 of their 3 notes. And when we hear that chord 6, which is A minor, we also, for 1 bar, have a rhythm change in the drum pattern. It actually becomes a tango rhythm for that 1 bar, linking between the verses. And at that point, we do feel like we might change key, and then we don't, which is quite surprising. Also note that there are leaps in the vocal part which add to the drama of that melody. So here we are at the end of the verse, and so far we've had a harmonic rhythm of basically 1 chord change per bar. And then, at the end of the verse, we hear the F chord, chord 4, held across for an extra bar, and it feels like it is almost in suspension. And it's almost word painting, because this falls on the phrase, "it's gonna be a drag." So that F chord is literally being dragged out as we hear those words. Then we hear a descending harmonic sequence, which is very Baroque-esque in style, followed by that saraband rhythm on the words misery that we heard at the beginning of the song. As we link into the bridge section, what is noticeable is the absence of any kind of drum fill or guitar obbligato to take us there. It's completely plain. Once we're into the bridge, we hear chord 6, that A minor chord that feels quite somber. Again, it feels like we might have a key change that doesn't happen. Then we hear those descending scale-like sequences with a dotted rhythm. This is the piano obbligato that George Martin supplied. This was the bit that supposedly, according to the official backstory on this song, that George Harrison couldn't play on the guitar. I wonder if that's actually just a cover story for the fact that George Martin just wanted to place these piano fills in here, which again sound very Baroque-esque. This is the second half of that bridge, and we can see that the harmonic rhythm, which is the speed that the chords change, is the slowest here that we've seen in the entirety of the song. We have just one chord change for every 2 bars, and that's to support the vocal melody, which has a descending scale-like sequence. Underneath all of that, we see the guitars are accenting on beats 2 and 3, much like they do in reggae, except that reggae has not become popular yet at this point, not in 1963. Reggae doesn't become popular until the end of the 60s and really into the 70s. So, after all of those verses and bridges, we finally come to the outro, and it's based on a 2-bar phrase taken from the end of the verse and used as a fade-out ending. Unsurprisingly, we're fading out using chords 6 and 1 repeated in a loop, as we did on Love Me Do, and as we will see in many more songs later in the Beatles' career. The voices sound more anguished than passionate here, and at the very end, we, for the first time, hear one solo voice rather than a chorus or any 2-part harmony, and it's John singing a little ad-lib as it fades to the end. Do you want to know a secret? Official songwriters Lennon and McCartney, official musicians, the Fab Four with George on lead vocals, recorded the 11th of February 1963 in just 8 takes, mixed down on the 25th of February 1963, and the technical team George Martin, Norman Smith, Richard Langham, and A.B. Lincoln. The backstory. We are led to believe that John wrote this song based on a Disney tune, Wishing Well, from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. He didn't want to sing it, so he gave it to George, who was regarded as a weaker singer with a smaller vocal range. Whatever the truth, George was not happy with his vocal on this song. So again, we find ourselves mostly in the key of E, but E natural minor and A minor also feature. The time signature once again is 4/4. The form: introduction, verse, verse, bridge, verse, and an outro with a fade out. Most of the phrasing is irregular. We see phrases of 5, 6, or 14 bars or measures in length. It makes use of an impressive 15 chords in less than 2 minutes. E minor, A minor, G major, F major, B major, G sharp minor, G sharp major, B7, E major, F sharp minor, G minor, C major, A major, C sharp minor, and B minor. In E major, that constitutes chords 1, 2, flattened 2, 3, flattened 3, 4, 5, 5, 7, and flattened 6. In E minor, otherwise known as Aeolian on E, we see chords 1, 4, and 5, and in A major we see chords 1, 2, 3, and 6. The combined vocal range is just over an octave, and the typical rhyme scheme is either A, B, C, D or A, A, B. So let's look at the score for Do You Want to Know a Secret? There are times when I've been looking at the songs on this album and wondering if I've been unduly harsh, whether I've seen classical influences where there are none. But on this song, Do You Want to Know a Secret? I have absolutely no doubt that this was written by someone with formal training. And if you want a smoking gun for that issue, you're looking at it right here. So in this introduction, we have a slow rubato feel. We start in E minor. By the time we get to the verse, we understand that this is the parallel minor key. We get a nice mixture of straight and swung rhythms here to underline the drama of this intro. But it's the harmony that takes center stage. And this largely vocally led introduction possibly could have a doo-wop influence, although actually I think it's something we would more likely see in a Neapolitan song. We have chord 1, chord 4, chord 1, flattened chord 3, which is a borrowed chord, flattened chord 2, which is a massive red flag because it's the Neapolitan sixth, then chord 5, which is exactly as it should be because the Neapolitan sixth is a pre-chord 5 chord. And then into the next bar on the next slide, it would go into chord 1. So what we're actually seeing here is the Neapolitan sixth, which is the flattened supertonic, that is flattened chord 2, in a minor key, that has to resolve to chord 5, which it does. It's been set up with another borrowed chord so that it doesn't sound like it's just been thrown in. And then it resolves chromatically down through a figure in the guitar part and then on to chord 1. But when it moves to chord 1, it isn't E minor, it's E major. So we've actually switched tonality. That also means that this song includes the tierce to Picardy, where you hear the major when you expected the minor third. In the Baroque period, we tended to have the Neapolitan sixth in first inversion, and we did that because that avoided the appearance of a tritone in the lower part of the chord, the tritone's other name being the devil's interval. And typically this chord is used in things like chorales or some kind of sacred music, and you definitely don't want to be including the devil's interval when you're worshipping God. By the time we get to the Romantic period, we were embracing the idea of making music as dramatic as possible, and so sometimes you actually wanted that tritone. But if you didn't, and I suspect they didn't in this song, there are ways round it. One of them is to do what has been done here, to include the chord in root position, but to arpeggiate the chord on the guitar so that you don't actually hear that interval, which is very clever. This is a masterwork. If one of my harmony students came to me and showed me something that looked like this, I would be absolutely thrilled. To think that someone like John Lennon, and no offence is meant to him, but someone like him with no training just stumbled over this is not just ridiculous, it's insulting to anyone with formal training. And I really don't understand how someone with formal training could look at this and not think that this was written by somebody else. There's the setup of the Neapolitan sixth, the chord itself, its resolution, and then a chromatic movement into the new key, all in the space of a few beats. Meanwhile, there's film footage of John Lennon in the 70s, so after the Beatles have long since broken up, and he's plodding away at a piano, saying, "Yoko, what's this chord?" because he's still clueless. So to think that he accidentally stumbled over this kind of thing at the beginning of his time with the Beatles is just madness. So we get into the verse, and what do we see? We have a 6-chord progression which is looped. Chord 1, 3, flattened 3, 2, 5, 7, and 1. And within that we have another chord stream, which is chord 3, flattened 3 and 2, the kind of thing that we saw previously on songs like P.S. I Love You or Ask Me Why. At the end of the progression, we see that perfect cadence, so the whole thing is tied together nicely and resolves. The melody for the vocals contains this rising scale-like figure, and it feels very sweet and very innocent and almost childlike. Underneath, there's a shuffle feel to the drums and a rhythmic interplay between the guitar and bass that includes a falling chromatic figure on that borrowed chord. The bass falls in contrary motion to the vocals. The guitar work seems quite impressive here, and I wonder how hard it was to play. We also note the absence of any backing vocals because, in keeping with the layering technique that the Beatles would become famous for later on, the backing vocals do not enter until the second verse. So we're still in the verse here, and a lot of the details we had on the previous slide still apply. But we do have a few new developments. There's a surprise use of the flattened chord 6 at the end of the phrase. The bass line is developed. It has a sort of stepwise motion that rises and falls. It bounces and rocks us, much like a lullaby. And the shuffle beat in the drums is interrupted during the fills. The guitar and bass become much more syncopated than they were previously. So here we see the end of the verse and also the beginning of the bridge. And the verse ends initially with an interrupted cadence, and then we have this linking section with a dramatic falsetto that provides us with an imperfect cadence, which is quite surprising to the ear. And underneath all of this, we have this frenetic movement in the backbeat to aid the link between sections. As we go into the bridge, we move into A major, but it's done so subtly that we don't immediately notice. The chord choices are mostly secondary harmony, so the key feels a bit ambiguous. If we were in E major still, chord 5 would have to be major, because as I told you at the beginning, chord 5 is always major, regardless of whether we're in a major or minor key, because we've rigged the system that way. You'll notice that I've included the chords in both E major and A major to demonstrate the point. When we get to that B minor chord, we know for sure that we have moved into A major, and we did so by removing those D sharps. Meanwhile, the guitar part has a syncopated rhythm that is even more complicated than before. So here we see the end of the bridge on the left-hand side, and as we come out of that bridge, we're going from A major back into E major, and we do so via a pivot chord, which is a chord that is in common to both keys. We see the guitar part go back to its syncopated rhythm that it had in the verse, and the drum and the bass provide a fill to link back round into the next verse. On the right hand side we see the outro. This coda comes in after the words "I'm in love with you", and this is basically the end part of the verse, a 2-bar section looped and then played 3 times as it fades out. We see an interrupted cadence that itself becomes interrupted and turns into an imperfect cadence instead. And I can't help but wonder if that is a sort of musical joke, interrupting an interrupted cadence. There's a place. Official songwriters Lennon and McCartney. Official musicians, the Fab Four with John on lead vocals. Recorded the 11th of February 1963 in 13 takes. Mixed down on the 25th of February 1963, and the technical team, George Martin, Norman Smith, Richard Langham, and A.B. Lincoln. The backstory. This song was written just before the recording session and performed first on that mammoth day of recording. However, due to the overdubs, it was still the last of their original songs to be completed. With regards to this song, John and Paul can't get their story straight. John said that he wrote it to sound like a Motown tune, and Paul, really Billy, said that they wrote it together and that it was inspired by the musical West Side Story, from the song Somewhere, which notably has the line, "There's a place for us." So once again, we find ourselves for the last time in E major, but the bridge is in C sharp minor. The time signature is 4/4, and the form, introduction, verse, verse as a variant, bridge, verse, and an outro with a fade out. The phrasing is mostly regular with some irregular phrasing. Typically we see 8 or 12 bar phrases, but we can also find 5 and 13 bar phrases too. The total number of chords is 8. We see E7, A major, E major, C sharp minor, B major, G sharp minor, F sharp minor, and G sharp major. In E major, that constitutes chord 1, 1, 7, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, which is almost the entire diatonic suite. In C sharp minor, we can find chord 1, chord 4, chord 5, and chord 6. The combined vocal range is almost 2 octaves, and the typical rhyming scheme is A, B, 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 C, D. So now let's take a look at the score for There's a Place. So we find ourselves in E major with a song that is almost like a hybrid of Please Please Me and Love Me Do. Like Please Please Me, we have a similar arrangement. We have a grace note before that pick-up note on beat 4, that harmonica obbligato in the introduction. That harmonica part is also doubled with one of the guitars. We hear that obbligato performed twice, as we do on Please Please Me, before it abruptly ends and the vocals come in. But then we have that shuffle beat and the use of chord 1 and 4 in a loop, as we saw on Love Me Do and also in Misery. When the vocals do come in, they do so halfway through the bar, in a shape reminiscent of an inverted turn in thirds. A turn being an ornament on the melodic line made popular in the classical period. Then the vocals pause and then continue on in sixths. We also hear grace note accents in the drums. As we get into the verse, we notice that the phrasing is fragmented to give that melancholy feel, in the same way that we saw in the song Misery. The harmonies are mostly in sixths and fifths. In fact, we even get some consecutive fifths on the words I feel. There's heavy use of chord 1 and chord 4, which even gives us the occasional plagal cadence. So the harmony here once again reminds us of Love Me Do and Misery. They've missed it off on this score, but John often sings a trill to the end of his phrasings. Underneath all these vocal parts, we can see that the bass rhythm is developed into a 2-bar loop with a syncopated shuffle feel in the drums. So now we're well into the verse here. Between all of the parts, we hear a sort of tango-inspired rhythm, which gives drama but also bounce to the song. That rhythm also sometimes lapses into a rising, stepwise triplet figure, particularly heard in the guitar and bass. Initially, we hear the continuance of those fragmented phrases, resulting in a 6/5 imperfect cadence. Those fragmented phrases are then switched out for held notes with lots of drama that want to resolve onto chord 4. we see an emphasis on the words mind and time, and the vocal harmonies are shaped much like that of the harmonica hook we heard in the intro. So here we can see the end of the first verse and the turnaround into the second, which is a variant, and we can see part of that variant on the right-hand side of the slide. So let's start with the left-hand side. As we come to the end of the verse, we hear the harmonica obbligato from the introduction, and it overlaps with John's singing. So if he was really playing the harmonica and singing, how could he do those things at the same time? If John is singing and he's also playing the harmonica, how could he ever have played this song live? Was it ever intended to be performed live? Then we hear that inverted turn-like figure, which links us back into the next verse. And normally when we have these sort of linking sections between verses or verses into bridges, we get an instrumental fill. At least we get a drum fill, something. But here we have nothing. Everything else pulls out, and we just have a focus on that inverted turn figure in two-part harmony. The harmonic rhythm, the speed that the chords change, has slowed here. So far we've only seen basically one chord per bar, and now it's more like one chord for every 2 or 3 bars. So as we come into the line, like I love only you, the music then moves on to chord 5. The melodic line adds in the 7th, so we get 5-7, which adds a bit of tension into the music. And then it passes on to chord 4 and sort of hangs there on these long sustained notes. The music feels a little slow, so to aid it on its way, we have this triplet figure on the word only. So here we see the end of the variant form of the verse turning into the bridge. And in the linking section between the two, the drum rhythm throws its focus onto beat 2 and 3. Meanwhile, the lead guitar has a syncopated rhythm on that linking section, but then becomes straight quavers into the bridge. The bass line does the opposite. It had a straight rhythm in the linking section, and then goes into a syncopated rhythm once it's actually into the bridge. In fact, it takes up a tango-inspired bass line. The harmonic work is also very interesting here. At the end of that variant of the verse, we heard chord 5. And then as we go into the bridge, it becomes chord 6. So we hear an interrupted cadence. But what we don't realise at first is that we've actually modulated into C sharp minor rather than moving into B major, which is what we first feel like the music is going to do. Once we're into that bridge, we have a call and response in the phrasing. The call section is in C sharp minor and has a single rising and falling melodic line, but the response section is in E major and makes use of parallel octaves. So we hear the music moving from the relative minor into the major, back and forth. The vocals arrive late here. They come in on beat 2 and have a somber or melancholy feel that is then transformed as it moves into the major. Those parallel octaves sound very sweet and naive, almost like the calling of distant bells. So here we're still in that bridge and we can see more of those call and response phrasings. The phrasings are very sweet and wistful, almost like a storytelling in their rise and fall into an arch shape. There's a sort of word painting on the phrase sad tomorrow as it falls in a very somber-like fashion. But then we get an upward leap on the word no, which sounds really emphatic and hopeful. This is a very interesting blending of major and minor keys. Those parallel harmonies are slightly disorientating to the listener, but not in an unpleasant way. The phrase ends on chord 3 in E major, and it sounds almost like a dead stop to the ear, which makes sense because we're going to turn back round for the final time into the verse. So we're finally approaching the end. On the left-hand side here we see the turnaround linking section that goes back into the verse, and it is exactly the same as we saw before. All of the instrumental parts cut out, and we hear that two-part harmony with that inverted turn-like figure. On the right-hand side we can see the outro, and it is built as a 2-bar loop section which is faded out, utilizing the title of the song, There's a Place. We hear a plagal cadence looped, so it goes back and forth between chord 4 and chord 1. We hear an antiphony between the vocals and the harmonica, and the harmonica uses an inverted triplet figure that is taken from John's vocal from earlier on the word only. In many respects, the ending is quite like the ending to the song Do You Want to Know a Secret? I haven't spoken about lyrics, and I said I did that on purpose, and I will talk about the lyrics in another set of videos. But I just want to make a note that on this album, it is mostly perfunctory love songs. But this one is slightly different. This is the most introspective song on this album. John sounds really lonely when he sings this song, and I can see a direct line between this and other songs later on, like Julia or Mother. It says in Memoirs that sometimes their songwriters knew how they were thinking and feeling better than the Beatles did, and I wonder if this is an early example of that. So, now we've gone through all of those songs, what kind of conclusions can we make? Here I've listed all of the songs on the album in the order that they were finished being recorded. The blue line is the marker between the 4 songs that were recorded and released as singles and B-sides before the rest of the album was recorded on the 11th of February 1963. The original songs are highlighted in red and the covers are in black. I have shown the main key for each song, how many chords it contained, the vocal range expressed in semitones, otherwise known as half steps, and how many takes it took to get to that final recording. It's clear that the original songs for this album were recorded first, and the covers last. The covers took fewer takes, perhaps because they were more familiar, or maybe it's a case that the originals were not by the Beatles, and that's why they needed more takes. Or, in the case that the originals were by the Beatles, perhaps they were just not rehearsed by them, although I doubt this is the case. I can find a few live recordings of the originals from this album before they recorded this album, but all of those were recorded after the Beatles were signed to EMI, so that doesn't really prove anything one way or the other. When we consider the recording sessions for this album on the 11th of February 1963, it does appear that the Beatles became more productive over the day. Perhaps they were becoming more familiar with the recording process. Or maybe it's just the familiarity of those covers that were left to last. They must have run out of time, though, because they attempted to record Hold Me Tight and abandoned it, and that song was released on their follow-up album with the Beatles. So what can we say about the songs directly? We have a 3-chord song that required 18 takes to get to that final version, and a 15-chord song that only took 8 takes. We have to wonder why this is the case. Maybe it has something to do with vocal range, and indeed the difficulty that the Beatles had singing on those tracks. The song with the fewest chords had the widest vocal range, and the song with the most chords had the narrowest vocal range. The originals generally have a wider vocal range, and there seems to be a greater correlation between the vocal range and the amount of takes than between the amount of chords that a song had and the amount of takes it took to get to that final version. So what does that mean? Perhaps it means that the more vocally challenging the song was, the more takes it took to get to that final recording. Now, does that imply that the Beatles were only singing rather than playing? It might. Certainly, the complexities of the instrumental parts reflected in the greater number of chords contained in the song don't seem to have that same sort of correlation on the amount of takes required. And I would have thought that it's much easier to sing a song than to play a song. On top of the extended vocal range that we can see in the original songs, it's also worth noting that they do generally contain more chords than the covers, that they're more likely to have irregular phrasing, that they're more likely to have advanced ideas in harmony that I would normally associate with a classical education in music theory. In fact, it's also very interesting to note that the B-sides on their singles were more harmonically difficult with more chords than the A-sides that they supported, and I wonder why that was. Rhythm has been an important factor on this album, and the original songs generally involve more interesting rhythms, often borrowed from dances, sometimes Baroque, sometimes Latin. But generally, even though the meter is constantly 4/4, the rhythm is never neglected. The meter is 4/4 throughout this album, but that makes sense because 4/4 is the easiest time signature to dance to. As I said at the beginning, 5 of the 8 original songs on this album are written in E, and I'd really like to know why that is. I have heard some theories about the practicality of playing in E, the chord shapes, the ability to move in and out of other related keys, and even into things like E blues scale, for example. But I'm not a guitarist, so I'm not sure whether any of those are true. If you are a guitarist and you have an idea about that, then please do share it with us in the comments section. I have pondered over whether the Beatles actually played on this album. Sometimes I wondered if they were permitted to play the covers, since they knew them already. But if you are going to hire session players, which I suspect they did, then you'd probably just ask the session players to play everything, since you've hired them already. Certainly I don't think that Ringo played on this album. I suspect that Andy White, who was a regular session player for EMI, was brought back after he played on their first single, so that the drums would have a sense of continuity throughout the album. So in summary, the songs from this album include far too many anomalies and references to advanced theoretical music training. Likewise, the original songs demonstrate a working knowledge of musical periods and genres that the Beatles were unlikely to have known or cared about. It is highly unlikely that these songs were the work of illiterate musical novices. I don't know if the original songs from the Decca demo were genuinely written by John and Paul, but their derivative nature is key to their plausibility. They were far more likely to have been the work of the Beatles than any of the original songs on the Please Please Me album. I think there are probably a few writing teams or individuals behind the 8 originals on this album. Here I've listed the 4 teams, and take this with a massive grain of salt. But I think P.S. I Love You and Ask Me Why might have been by the same people. That Please Please Me and I Saw Her Standing There might have been by the same people. That Love Me Do and Misery might have been by the same people. And lastly, that There's a Place and Do You Want to Know a Secret might have been by the same authors also. And that is it. We have made it to the end of this video. And if you have made it to the end of this video, then you are a hero and you are brilliant, and I thank you ever so much because I know that this has been a very long video. I will cover all of the other Beatles songs in due course, but I think that this has been a very intense experience trying to get everything into one video for just one album. So going forward, I will probably record individual videos for the rest of the songs. Do let me know your thoughts in the comment section, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.